Okay, so you think you understand a movie theater. You've bought the ticket. You've smelled the popcorn the second the doors slid open. You've handed over $8 for a soda and thought, man, this place is printing money. Reasonable. That's exactly how it looks from the concession line. Here's what's actually happening. A typical movie theater hands somewhere between 50 and 60% of every ticket sale straight back to the movie studio. And on a giant opening weekend, that number can climb even higher, sometimes past 65% for a single blockbuster. So on the biggest, busiest, most crowded night of the year, when the parking lot is full and there's a line out the door, the theater is keeping the smallest slice of every ticket it sells. The night that looks the most profitable is the night the studio is winning the hardest. So how does that work? How do you run a business where your best-selling product barely belongs to you? How does a theater survive when the thing it's famous for, showing movies, is the part it makes almost nothing on? The answer isn't the movie. The answer is everything wrapped around the movie. It's a system, quietly engineered over a century, built out of contracts, psychology, real estate, timing, and one very specific bag of corn. To understand how a theater actually makes money, we have to start with the strangest deal in retail. Most stores buy a product, mark it up, and sell it. A theater doesn't own the product at all. When a new film comes out, the theater doesn't purchase copies of it. It rents the right to show it, and the rent is a percentage of every ticket sold. That percentage isn't fixed, it slides. And which direction it slides tells you everything. In the opening week, when demand is white hot and everybody wants to see the new thing right now, the studio holds all the leverage. So the studio takes the biggest cut, often more than half, sometimes far more. The theater agrees because it has no choice. If you want the movie everyone's talking about, you take the studio's terms. But here's the part that flips the whole thing. As the weeks go by, that split moves. Week 1, the studio might take 60%. Week 3, maybe 50%. By the 5th or 6th week, the theater might finally be keeping 70% of every ticket. The economics literally reverse over time. The problem? By week 6, almost nobody is buying tickets anymore. The film everyone rushed to see is now playing to half-empty rooms. So the theater keeps a big slice of a tiny pie, right after handing over a tiny slice of a huge one. This is the core trap of the entire business. Your busiest days pay you the least. Your most profitable days are the ones where hardly anyone shows up. No sane person would design a business this way. So the people who run theaters didn't build their business on tickets at all. Walk into a theater and buy a large popcorn. It might cost you $9, $10, $11. Now think about what's actually inside that bucket. The corn itself, the raw kernels, the oil, the salt, the bag, cost the theater somewhere around 50 to 80 cents. That's it. Everything above that is margin. The markup on movie popcorn routinely runs over 1,000%. On fountain soda, it's arguably worse. The syrup and cup cost pennies, and the profit margin sits somewhere near 85%. This is where the business you thought you understood actually lives. Here's the number that reframes everything. Concessions, popcorn, soda, candy, nachos, make up only about 20% of a theater's total revenue, but they generate roughly 40% of its profit. Read that again. 1/5 of the money brings in nearly half the profit. And there's a beautiful reason why. The theater has to split ticket money with the studio, but it splits the popcorn money with no one. 100% of that soda, that candy, that ridiculous $10 bucket stays inside the theater's own bank account. So now the strange design starts to make sense. The movie isn't the product. The movie is the bait. The theater is essentially a restaurant that shows films to get you in the door and keep you sitting there long enough to get hungry. The screen is the marketing. The concession stand is the business. And once you see it that way, every decision the theater makes suddenly has a logic to it. Think about why ticket prices stay lower than they probably should. Economists actually studied this, looking at real theater data, and found something clever. Theaters deliberately keep tickets affordable, not out of kindness, but strategy. A cheap ticket pulls in more bodies. More bodies means more people walking past the popcorn. If the theater jacked up ticket prices to make real money on admission, fewer people would come, and it would sell far less of the high-margin stuff that actually pays the bills. So they underprice the front door on purpose, to over-earn at the counter. The $10 popcorn isn't gouging the ticket buyer, it's subsidizing the ticket buyer. The person willing to pay for snacks is quietly paying to keep the ticket cheap for everyone else. But even a genius popcorn margin can't save you if the building itself is bleeding money, and this is where the second half of the story begins. A theater is one of the most expensive physical businesses you can possibly run. Consider what it actually takes just to open the doors. Building a modern multiplex from the ground up costs millions. The reclining seats alone, the ones everyone now expects, run into serious money per auditorium. And the projector, that one piece of equipment most people never think about, is brutal. When the industry switched from film reels to digital, theaters were forced to install digital projectors that could cost well over $100,000 per screen. For a premium large format screen, the equipment for a single auditorium can run to several $100,000. Now multiply that across 10, 12, 16 screens. The theater spent all of that before selling a single ticket. And here's the cruelty of that math. A movie theater's costs barely change based on how many people show up. The building has to be heated and cooled whether it's packed or empty. The staff has to be paid whether one person buys a ticket or 300 do. The projector runs the same for a sold-out room and a room with 4 people in it. The rent on that enormous footprint is due on the first of the month regardless. In economics, this is called high fixed costs, and it's the quiet monster underneath the entire industry. A theater doesn't gently lose money on a slow night. It hemorrhages it, because almost everything it spends is spent before anyone even decides whether to come, which means the entire business hangs on one number that most owners obsess over more than anything else: the number of butts in seats spread across the entire week, not just Friday night. The empty Tuesday afternoon showing is the one that decides whether the theater lives or dies, because the costs for that Tuesday show are almost identical to the Friday one, but the revenue can be a tiny fraction. This is why theaters fight so hard for anything that fills a dead seat. Discount Tuesdays, loyalty programs, matinee pricing. Every one of those is a desperate attempt to squeeze revenue out of hours the building is already paying for anyway. An empty seat isn't neutral. An empty seat is a cost the theater already paid for and got nothing back on. Now layer on the middlemen the theater can't avoid, because the studio relationship goes deeper than just the ticket split. Studios don't only take a cut, they dictate terms. For the biggest films, a studio can require a theater to keep the movie on its screens for a minimum number of weeks, sometimes forcing a theater to show a fading blockbuster in a big auditorium long after audiences have moved on, taking up a screen that could be showing something more profitable. Studios can demand a film open on a certain number of screens. The theater, hungry for the hit, agrees. The negotiating power, especially with the massive studios behind the massive tentpole films, runs almost entirely one direction. The theater needs the blockbuster far more than the blockbuster needs any single theater. And that dependency has consequences you can actually watch play out. Think about what happens to a small independent theater trying to compete against a giant chain. The big chain has hundreds of screens, so it walks into negotiations with enormous buying power. It can promise a studio a wide release across dozens of cities. The little 2-screen theater down the street can promise almost nothing by comparison, so it gets worse terms, later access, and thinner margins on the exact same film. Scale, once again, quietly decides who survives. The big chains aren't just bigger, they're structurally cheaper to run per screen, and they negotiate from strength. That's why so much of the industry has consolidated into a handful of enormous chains, and why the corner cinema keeps closing. But suppliers and studios aren't even the biggest threat anymore. Because for 100 years, the theater had one thing nobody could take away. It was the only place to see a new movie. That was the entire foundation. You wanted the new release, you came to us. There was no other option. And then that foundation cracked. Streaming didn't just give people another choice. It changed what watching a movie even means. Not a drive, not a ticket, not a babysitter, not $11 popcorn, just a couch, a subscription you already pay for, and a pause button for when you need the bathroom. And during the pandemic, when the theaters went dark completely, studios discovered something dangerous. They could release films straight to streaming, skip the theater entirely, and audiences would still watch. The window, that sacred period when a movie played only in theaters, shrank from months down to weeks. For some films, it vanished altogether. The numbers tell the story bluntly. Annual movie ticket sales in the United States have fallen dramatically over the past couple of decades. By some measures, admissions have been cut roughly in half compared to their peak. Theater revenue in a recent year came in well below where it stood before the pandemic. The audience didn't disappear overnight. It slowly, quietly, decided that most movies just aren't worth leaving the house for. And a business built entirely on getting people to leave the house suddenly had to answer a question it had never faced in a century. Why should anyone come at all? Here's where it gets interesting. Because the theaters that are surviving figured out the answer. If home can now do watching a movie cheaper and easier, then the theater has to sell something home fundamentally cannot. Not the film. Home has the film now. The experience. The thing you literally cannot replicate on a couch. So watch what the smart theaters started doing. Giant premium screens, 4 stories tall, with sound systems you feel in your chest. An event you'd never recreate in a living room. Full reclining leather seats, reserved and assigned, so the trip feels like an upgrade instead of a gamble. Actual restaurants inside serving real meals and alcohol right to your seat, turning a 2-hour movie into a whole night out and quietly raising that all-important spend per customer far beyond what a popcorn bucket ever could. The theater stopped competing on the movie because it had already lost that fight. It started competing on everything around the movie. Exactly the same instinct that built the popcorn stand a century ago, just aimed at a new enemy. And that reframe is the entire modern survival strategy. The old theater sold access to a film. The new theater sells an evening you can't get anywhere else. The screen is bigger than yours. The sound is bigger than yours. The seat is nicer than yours. Someone brings you dinner. It's loud and communal and out of the house. And for the right movie, on the right night, that's still worth paying for, even when the same film hits streaming a few weeks later. The theaters betting everything on being a premium experience are the ones still standing. The ones still selling nothing but a screen and a ticket are the ones you keep watching close. So let's be honest about both sides of this, because neither cancels the other. The critics are right that it's a brutal business. Thin ticket margins, punishing fixed costs, studios that hold most of the cards, and a streaming tide that keeps rising. Plenty of theaters genuinely can't survive it, and the empty screens in your town are proof. But the believers are right too. There is something a phone will never deliver. A room full of strangers gasping at the same moment, a screen too big to look away from, a night that feels like an occasion instead of a background. Both things are true at once, and any honest look at this business has to hold both. But here's what nobody in the industry disputes. The economics of a movie theater are almost perfectly upside down from what they look like. The tickets you think pay the bills mostly don't. The popcorn you think is a ripoff is the thing keeping the lights on. The busy nights earn the least, the empty seats cost the most, and the whole fragile machine survives on the margin of a 50-cent bag of corn sold for $10. So the next time you walk in, hand over your ticket, and grab that absurdly overpriced bucket on the way to your seat. Remember what you're actually looking at. You're not looking at a place that shows movies. You're looking at the surface of a machine, one that spent 100 years learning that the movie was never the product. You were. And that bucket in your hand isn't a snack. It's the entire business, disguised as a treat.